How many people are confident they know what cognitive science is? You notice my hand's not up. I've been in this business a long time and my hand is still not up. We had a meeting of cognitive scientists in south of France around 2001, and as an exercise we asked everyone in the room to write down their definition of what cognition was. We got 50 different definitions and there's almost no overlap between them. There was quite clear that nobody was capable of agreeing on what cognition is. So this is a word that's going to need a bit of practice to wield. We could do the etymological route and trace the origins of the word. That's not always a good way to find meaning, though, because meaning changes over time. So it has something to do with knowing, the Latin root that suggests it has something to do with knowing. And I like to think of cognitive science as the science that studies knowing, which is oddly recursive because we tend to think of science as being one of the means by which we come to know things. So we're kind of shining a spotlight on ourselves a little bit as we come to study knowing. And I like to think of knowing as being a relationship, not as being a thing, but a relationship between the knower and the known. The knower might be you, for example. It might also be a group of people. It might be Western civilization. It might be this scientific community. I don't know. We got to ask. These are, you could say the government knows that there's an election coming up. The government knows? What does that mean? So there's someone who knows we're going to call a subject. And what do you know? Well, the stuff you know speaks of some kind of a view of what the world is. Might include general elections. And that's all a bit philosophical, isn't it? A lot of science proceeds on a daily basis without worrying too much about philosophical questions. Cognitive science is never far from philosophical questions, so we always have to sort of bear in mind where we are. That makes it challenging, but it also makes it a lot of fun. There's a branch of philosophy known as epistemology, which deals with knowledge and knowing, and many of the concerns that we have here. So I like to think of cognitive science as being sort of practical epistemology. It's a practical business. We're engaged in science and doing experiments, taking measurements and constructing theories, modeling the world, modeling ourselves. But it's very, very close to philosophy. So we have to always remind ourselves that there are important questions here. When I prepare materials to advertise this lecture or this module or the master's program that we run in cognitive science, I got to put my cards on the table and write in one line what I'd say cognitive science is, which I've just failed to do. So there, under those circumstances, with a gun held to my head, I say it's the business of looking at the relations between minds, brains, and behavior. That probably suckered you into taking this course in the first place, didn't it? Minds, brains, and behavior. And when we do that, we're already in deep water. Because right around this territory, we find entities like spirit, consciousness, intellect, and soul. As we trace the history of ideas, many of the topics we are concerned with will be claimed by others, often non-scientists. I'm not saying science is the only route to knowledge, but there are clearly constituencies like theology which lay claim to these, and we got to be careful. So we're dealing in contested ground. And what we'll see is that in particular, this business of mind is very unstable. We don't really know what a mind is, and very often the language that we talk about minds has been adopted from something more like a soul or a spirit. So that puts us in interesting territory already. Those of you who are science students who are familiar with test tubes and amp meters and such like will be already feeling a little apprehensive appropriately. So we're going to look at those three things, minds, brains, and behavior. Use that as a working definition of what we're about. And let's start off with this one, the brain. Now, it's a kind of a fatuous claim, but it's easy to make. The brain is the most complex object in the entire known universe, bar none. The entire universe. The human brain is the most complex object from a human perspective. I'm not entirely sure that earthworms share that perspective. I don't know that aliens share that perspective. I don't know that rocks have perspectives that they might share. This seems like a particularly human way of interpreting the world, to valorize this thing. However, I'm doing so from a human perspective, so I'm going to stick by my claim that it's the most complex object I can think of in the known universe. However, when we talk about minds, brains, and behavior, this is the simplest of those three, as well as being the most complicated thing that we know of. With brains, we have a great advantage. We know where brains are. We know where to find them. They're inside skulls. The brain weighs about 3.5 pounds. It's very fatty meat. It's very high in cholesterol. If you eat too many brains, it's bad for your arteries. Let that be the first lesson you learn from cognitive science. Don't eat too many brains. Okay, you're not zombies. They're not good for your health. It's a fascinating yoke. We're only at the beginning of trying to understand what the hell this thing is and what it does and how we should approach it. Should we think of that as the soul? It's kind of gooey and grey. Are we our brains? These are the kind of questions that we will be dealing with, but at least with brains, we know where they are. Behavior might seem on the face of it to be much simpler. Here's a bunch of, look at you guys, you're all behaving there, you're watching a lecture. I mean, I'm behaving, I'm giving a lecture. There's someone doing the laundry, dog's taking a poop, someone's playing 2 banjos at the same time, someone's scratching. Those are behaviors. Why are behaviors difficult? There's a very deep reason why behaviors are difficult, and let's illustrate it. I think this is Christopher from Winnie the Pooh, but let's just pretend it's Christopher who's just killed his grandmother with an axe and is going to bury her corpse. Now let's say what his behavior is. Well, at the moment he's digging, that's a behavior. He's pushing the spade with his leg, that's a behavior. He's worrying about getting caught, that's a behavior. He's burying his grandmother's corpse, who did I say he killed? He's burying a corpse, that's a behavior. He's also digesting his breakfast, that's a behavior. In other words, the flow of things that happen in the world don't come with labels neatly categorized into behaviors, and there's no one way of saying what a behavior is. We could choose to focus, perhaps appropriately, on the fact that he's burying a corpse. But we might actually be his gastroenterologist and be more worried about his digestion, and so more worried about what's going on in his small intestine. Maybe. The point is that the way that we frame our observations implicates us. So we like to think of science as being somehow impersonal when we consider whether or not we should call Pluto a planet. Okay, there's a human social thing there because we make the definitions, and Pluto is going to be absolutely unchanged by anything astronomers around here say. But we like to think of Pluto as being something that we have no influence in, and science is making statements simply about matters of fact. But when it comes to the business of behavior, and we have a strong interest in understanding behavior, we become implicated in the observation in a way that's quite unlike observing the stars. Because we decide to frame things one way. We decide to say Christopher is burying his grandmother, or Christopher is digging, or Christopher is worrying. We've framed the observation, so we're part of the phenomenon in a way. We've set things up in a particular way, and that influences everything that comes thereafter. That's why behavior is difficult, because there's no way of simply saying what a behavior is, and once we identify a behavior, we're involved in the description in a means that prevents us being 100% objective. Objectivity is not something we can really aspire to here. That doesn't mean we don't care about objectivity. It means we recognize that we're somehow involved in describing the phenomenon. That's very reminiscent of what I just said about the brain being the most complex object in the known universe from a human perspective. So we'll find in cognitive science we often have to wonder about perspectives and about who's saying what, who's making claims. Minds. Now of the three, minds are definitely the most difficult, not because minds are incredibly complex, but because we don't know where the hell they are, or what they are, or whether they exist, or how to count them, or is mind just a way of saying soul, or it's a difficult word to wield. Nobody knows how to wield this word with authority. I'm going to work on a hypothesis that most of you are comfortable with the view that you have one mind, one mind each, let's say. I have one mind. Nevertheless, when we come to, we won't be able to identify the boundaries of that thing. We won't be able to find its inner workings necessarily, unless we get a lot clearer in what it is that we mean by this word. And here, of course, we stand in, it's 2016, we're in Ireland, that has a particular setting, culturally, historically, and so on. And the word mind features a lot in our language, but we use it in ways that are completely undisciplined. We talk about making up your mind, seeing something in your mind's eye. You say someone must be out of their mind. That's an interesting one. What does it mean to be out of your mind? Where the hell are you if you're out of your, are you your mind? I don't know. Absent-minded, or having a mind like a steel trap, a one-track mind, say something's going to blow your mind. There's very many senses going on here, and everyday language use is not going to help us much, but it is pointing. We look at everyday language use sometimes, and it points us towards, well, it can inform us about something. In this case, it's telling us that the word mind is not stable. Nobody quite knows what they're talking about when they talk about minds, and I'm afraid that's simply the way things are. We'll meet some of these unstable words. Thinking is another good one. Most people feel fairly confident that they can say that they're thinking, when they're thinking, what they're thinking of, until they look more closely at it, and then the word thinking becomes equally problematic. We'll park that one for later. At the moment, let's just notice that mind seems to be a problem. Now, if we think of the various faculties of mind or attributes of mind that we're familiar with, where we wield this word with a certain confidence, what do we come up with? We find things like perception, sensation, reasoning, memory, thinking, all those words. And you might say, well, that's just psychology. And we'll make sense of that statement in a little bit. But they all look kind of problematic, because if we get back onto familiar scientific ground and we start to talk about measuring and weighing and instruments and protocols and standards and such like, we feel much safer. So it almost looks like, well, the mental is kind of a problem, but you know, we know how to do physical sciences, we know how to do physics. Physics isn't the whole of science, you know. There's very many kinds of science. There's chemistry, biology, and what about economics? Is psychology a science? Not everyone's happy with calling psychology a science. What about anthropology and geography and geology? Scientific aspects to these. So it's not a single unified church, but very many people in these diverse disciplines often refer back to physics. You can speak of physics envy among scientists, because they seem to have the real grasp on reality, right? So everyone wants to do this kind of science that makes them look a bit like physics. And we're obviously not doing very well in that regard here today. But I want to point out that it's not simply the case that the physical is easy and the mental is difficult. It's often presented that way, as if this whole business of perceiving and imagining and doing and feeling, that was all mysterious and had to be explained somehow, and the explanation was going to be much simpler when we got it down to physics. As if physical was an opposition in which the physical is uncomplicated and the mental is the difficult one. We have to stuff that into a physical view. That's not quite accurate. Oppositions that involve the word mind often dissolve when we look at them hard. So mind-brain is one relationship we're going to be interested in. Mental-physical is another opposition that arises when we talk about minds. So imagining a blue hippopotamus seems to be a purely mental act. Kicking a rock might seem to be a physical kind of act. One thing to note is that the word mind and the way mental works here is local culturally. It doesn't translate well into other languages. Most other languages, because they involve a lot of exchange with people who share this view of the world, can deal with this, but even if you don't have to go far, you don't have to go to Australian Aboriginal languages or Amazonian Indian languages. If we try to translate mind into German, it doesn't go. There's a couple of alternatives, and even though most of the philosophy of mind we'll be talking about is actually rooted in France, Germany, and England, the word mind just doesn't move around very well. It's not clear. You know, a long time ago someone invented a teapot, and these days you go to China, you go to Indonesia, you go to Termenfecken, or you go to Las Vegas, And you'll find teapots all over the place. Nobody has a problem with this. We know when we're in the presence of a teapot. It's not, sure, teapots were a cultural invention. They appeared at one point in time. But since then, teapots are simply available to everybody in every culture, as far as I'm aware. I'm not aware of any real problems that arise in discussing teapots. Minds are not teapots. They don't travel like that. The words that we use have this flavor of locality to them that we need to bear in mind. See what I did? Okay. Here's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know if you can see it very well. This is Caravaggio's painting of Doubting Thomas sticking his finger into the wound in Jesus' side. Doubting Thomas is an interesting figure because he was a skeptic. In some respects, he's like a scientist. People came to him and they told him an unlikely story, Jesus is risen, and he said, that's a skeptic. A skeptic wants evidence, argument. A skeptic wants to be convinced. And the way to convince Doubting Thomas was to bring, physically, Jesus to him. And look what he's doing. He's putting his finger in the side. I'm sorry about this, but poking. He's feeling it and listening to it. And it's wet and it's warm and it's bloody and gory. It's 100% mental. It's experiential. The kind of proof he's looking for is a proof that it only exists in the lived experience of a subject. There's nothing physical about the sensation of wetness. The feel, the resistance you get when you know when you stick your finger into a wound in Christ's side, and it's experiential. So his evidence, the proof of the physical proof of the resurrected Christ could only be got through the senses in this way. Now we're going to do one of those, let's examine our everyday language, and we're going to go to Twitter and see how do people use the word physical. Why not? It's physically impossible for me to pay attention during class. Physically attractive high school students are more likely to complete college. I'm not sure there's an attractive meter in physics, is there? Have you ever missed someone so much you feel physically sick? Now, is there anything more subjective than feeling sick? But it's physically sick, and that's really real. I physically cannot speak with pants on. Sleep with pants on. That's Bambi. Bless her, that's my favorite one. I am physically hurting. Oh my God, look at Bruno. 10 out of 10 agree it's physically impossible to say no to. Well, as usual, everyday language is not providing us with the clearest of signposts here, is it? It's doing one thing, though. There is a sense underlying all these of the really, really real, the incontrovertible, that which must be accepted. So the word physics here is meaning really, really real. And we don't want mental to mean totally imaginary and fictitious and made up. That's not going to work. And how do you ground the real? Well, we just saw one approach, Doubting Thomas, experience it for yourself. And absolutely, you cannot separate the experiential, the mental, from that. It doesn't mean anything. So the physical-mental distinction is not a simple distinction. It's not that there's this set of physical facts and there's this set of mental facts, this set of physical things and this set of mental things. It doesn't work like that. And indeed, if we ask, not Twitter, but if we ask physicists what's physics about, well, it's not about attractiveness or whether you can sleep with pants on, they kind of stop and they'll say, I see, which physics do you mean? Because there's multiple physics. This is Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton. Very difficult man, a very unpleasant man. A genius, obviously. The greatest physicist that ever lived, bar none, including Einstein. Also an alchemist, a point we'll come back to later. Grumpy sod. Newtonian physics was a revolution. He gave us the science of mechanics. Many of you will have heard of Newton's laws of motion. A body at rest will tend to stay at rest. A body in motion will continue at motion in a vacuum unless perturbed by something. These kind of force is equal to the mass multiplied by the acceleration. Newton's laws of motion describe with astounding accuracy how inanimate bodies behave, move under idealized circumstances. Physicists love ideal circumstances. You're familiar with the idea of the physicist who's asked to solve a practical problem in dairy farming, and he says, no problem, let's begin with a spherical cow in a vacuum. That's the way physicists sort of approach problems. Newton gave us a picture of how things move, but they're inanimate things. He gave us a picture of how inanimate things move under ideal circumstances. Newton gave us no account of how to account for this movement. None whatsoever. In a Newtonian world, in the physical world that emerged from Newton's vision, there are no agents. Nobody does anything. There's no volitional, willful source of action at all. Newton describes a world in which inanimate objects move under ideal circumstances. And Newton's physics is still with us. It hasn't gone away. We like to think that modern physics has left all that behind, at least since the theory of relativity. But let's relativize that observation first, shall we? Newton still provides the best account we have in the world of how inanimate objects that are about our size move when we're dealing with speeds and times that are understandable to us, that relate to our experience. So movement that happens in the course of a couple of seconds, for example, and things that are about as big as a bread box. When we move into modern physics, we do find a different world, but it doesn't relate to our world of experience. The observations from modern physics that go beyond and differ from the Newtonian framework are made at spatial scales that are either huge or tiny. They're not the size of a bread box. So when we get down to atomic scale, of which we have no physical experience, doubting Thomas never met an atom, when we get down to that scale, we need a different physics. When we talk about things which are light years in distance, then we need a different physics. But when we're talking about things that are about a meter long, Newton's physics is the best physics we have in the world. Likewise with time, if we make our observations, if we build instruments that are capable of making observations that are of the order of a millionth of a second, we need a different physics. If we discuss goings-on that occupy billions of years, we need a different physics. But if we're talking about stuff that goes on in the course of, over a course of a couple of seconds, which is how we live and understand things, Newton's physics is still the best. So Newton gave us an experientially grounded physics with nobody to experience it. Newton's physics is still the best physics in the world for describing the familiar world of objects that break and bounce and collide and move as long as there are no agents in the world. And this sets up a problem, because that Newtonian view there's no minds in that world whatsoever. This puts us in something of a quandary. I said science is diverse, and physics is one reference point, but it's not the only one. And the questions that we are looking at are very, very real. Indeed, we're asking about what do we mean by real. So these questions are not going to go away, so we have to agree that scientists are going to disagree. And that's going to be true in this course generally. You won't get any truth out of this course. You'll get precious few facts. You'll get hugely enriched questions, I hope. Because that's how we make progress in this area, is by learning to ask better questions. Asking what's the difference between the mental and the physical is already a question we've ruled out of bounds. We've looked at that and we've seen you can't separate the two. If you're asking about the mental, you're also asking about the physical, and you're also asking about what physics is, and it all opens up. So we learn to ask better questions. But we're also going to notice that we're in disputed territory. There are many constituencies here. Many people have a vested interest in this, and they don't always speak the same language. So one of the jobs as a cognitive scientist is to learn to relate observations from anthropology to observations from physics, to learn to relate observations from psychology to stuff from neuroscience. How does linguistics talk, how do linguists talk to any of these people? The Cognitive Science Society is a professional society that was formed in the 80s, and this is its logo. Around the edge you see linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, artificial intelligence, and education. It's an interesting collection. back there, that was 30 years ago, they saw these as being the major contributing disciplines to the business of cognitive science. So we can start to think of cognitive science now as a kind of a translation job, allowing these different disciplines to speak together in order to develop questions that don't run up against the same old problems, that don't keep us stuck in the same ruts, but that get richer, more nuanced. It's a really interesting business, but it's not by any means a simple business. So, in order to understand and to begin to unpack this, we're going to have to tell two stories. Oh, just one second. I want to record a little bit of this. Yeah. We're going to have to tell two stories, and they're quite different stories, and they're necessary in order to emphasize the fact that cognitive science is not the same thing as psychology. The first story is going to take us through the philosophy of mind, and we're going to cover 2,000 years in one lecture, and one of the richest topics available to mankind. It's horrible what we're doing to the philosophy of mind. We're butchering it in this class. We need, in other words, to establish some landmarks and have some view of how we got to where we are. And then the second story we're going to tell is a much shorter story, and it's the history of psychology as a discipline, which is only about 150 years old. So it's a much shorter story, and at the end of all that, I hope we'll have reached a point where we can see that psychology is a necessary part of cognitive science, but it has no particular privileged position within cognitive science. It represents one voice with one set of assumptions in a world in which we need to map between lots of different constituencies, lots of different assumptions. So we're going to just start off now. We're just going to scratch the surface of the philosophy of mind. And as we do so, there's some concerns that we can't avoid. When we establish landmarks, we want to find our feet in the philosophy of mind. These are two major poles that we need to consider. They're known as rationalism and empiricism, or the rationalist pole and the empiricist pole. And from the start, please let me emphasize, we're not dealing with these as opposites or as competing teams. We will identify characters and we will lampoon them as if they were, we'll have a token rationalist and a token empiricist, but it's not, the business of making sense of minds is not one crowd against the other. It's not the rationalists against the empiricists. Okay? Any topic that's of concern can be approached with rationalist concerns in mind, or with empiricist concerns in mind. Any rich topic can be addressed from these different poles, these different landmarks. In the empirical camp, we're dealing with what Thomas was doing there, senses and experience, perception. We're dealing with observation, and we're dealing with interaction with the world. In the rationalist camp, we're dealing with reason and logic and the intellect. And clearly, if we want to make sense of the business of knowing, we're going to need both. It's, I hope, immediately obvious to you that you learn by being in the world and doing things and having experiences. That's one way you learn. But it should also be clear to you that one way you come to know stuff is by the power of reason, by figuring things out, by thinking. And so these are going to represent large groups of concerns that belong together. Let's spell it out a little bit more. Rationalists emphasize the role of reason, the role of the intellect and understanding in coming to some knowledge. And that knowledge is hopefully reasonably certain. We like to think that reason gives us good results. We like to be sure that if we've reasoned correctly, we end up with something that is reasonably certain. And the domain in which this works best is probably mathematics. In mathematics, we even have the notion of proof. Now, in science, we do not have the notion of proof. Anyone who's ever said scientists have proven X, Y, or Z doesn't know the first thing about science. Science is not about proving, it's about asking questions, forming theories, coming to a substantiated knowledge which is always somewhat uncertain. There is no such thing as certainty in the business of science, but there is in mathematics, which makes mathematics an odd enterprise. You can be sure that you've got a right result in mathematics, but you might not know what the result is about. So mathematics is of great interest to rationalist concerns because it's all concerned with reasoning, it seems anyway. The kind of knowledge that you get from experience, from seeing with your own eyes, touching and feeling and smelling, acting on the world, is in some sense always somewhat uncertain. And so rationalists, or people of a rationalist bent, will tend to downplay that and emphasize the role of the intellect. And against that, we've got empirical concerns, and science is an empirical business. We make observations, we make hypotheses, we test those hypotheses. And so we're always a little bit uncertain, but actually if we do our work well, we end up with reasonably sure knowledge. And we want to improve that certainty, but we never arrive at an absolute certainty. We use experience and experimentation. Experimentation is the business of setting up the world in a particular way and then poking it in some way and seeing how it reacts. And from that, we've gained a little bit more information that can help us to know what we're on about. So knowledge here is always tentative. So if mathematics is the prime domain for the rationalist, and science is an example of an empirical concern, again, I caution these are not polar opposites. Let's consider two topics from both rationalist and empirical concerns. Let's consider mathematics first of all, because I've just said like the rationalists own it. That's nonsense. If we want to study mathematical knowledge, how we come to learn to count, to believe in Euclid's geometry or alternative geometries and so on, the rationalist has plenty to work with. We've got all the logical business, axioms, proofs, deductions of mathematics that you were all tortured with in school, or maybe you love, I don't know. But mathematics is presented as this formal reasoning. If we look at how people do mathematics, they start off counting on their fingers. Children in school recite their tables in unison. 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9. Those are of empirical concern. Mathematics is arrived at by scratching numbers onto surfaces. The fonts that we use, the number system that we use, are we using Roman numerals or Arabic numerals, is going to hugely matter to the mathematics we do. So mathematics doesn't belong to the rationalists. Although the domain of mathematics nicely illustrates rationalist concerns, which have to do with reason, no topic belongs to either camp. Now let's consider something like cooking, the foods you like to eat. Here, it might seem that we're totally at home with the empiricists, because this is all about flavors and smells and tastes and all that lovely business, textures and consistency. Yum. Empiricists love eating, but rationalists love eating as well, you know. And furthermore, your eating habits are not only informed by senses and textures and tastes, they're also concerned with you bring your intellect to bear. You may be vegetarian or vegan, which represents your understanding of how food is produced. You avoid stuff that you believe to be bad for you. You prefer some foods from others on reasonable grounds, on the grounds of reasoning about things as well. So even in cooking, which seems primarily to belong to the empiricists, we're not dealing with something which only admits of empirical inquiry. We're dealing with something which is also underpinned by reason, the intellect, and the understanding. As we progress, we'll see rationalist and empiricist concerns recur again and again in the topics that we take through. And in this lecture on Thursday, we're going to start off by looking at some philosophers who represent these various positions. But please don't ever describe it back to me in exams as rationalists believe X, empiricists believe Y. There are rationalist concerns in any rich phenomenon. There are empiricist concerns in any rich phenomenon. And it sort of grieves me that we have to, because we only have a limited amount of time, we have to paint things in such stark colors. But I hope you're going to get a sense for what the substance of the major debates are that serve to organize our knowing about knowing. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll pick this up again on Thursday.